My husband walked in smelling of crisp mountain air and sporting a goggle tan, rambling about the hardships of a tech conference in San Francisco. I waited for silence, took a sip of Merlot, and asked about the receipt he thought was buried. The moment his smile vanished, I knew our 8-year marriage had become a crime scene, and I was the judge. My name is Alara, and at 32 years old, I had spent the last hour sitting in the dark. The only light in our living room came from the dying embers in the fireplace, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. I was not asleep. I was not resting. I was waiting. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed exactly 10 times, marking the precise moment Julian was scheduled to walk through the door. The lock clicked, followed by the heavy thud of the oak door swinging open. Julian stepped inside, dragging his carry-on suitcase with an exaggerated heaviness. He sighed loudly. A performance meant for an audience of one. He dropped his keys in the bowl and rubbed his face. He immediately launched into the script I knew he had rehearsed on the plane ride home. He complained about the rubbery chicken served at the gala dinner and how the keynote speakers droned on until midnight every single night. He told me his back ached from hotel mattresses and that he had missed me so much it physically hurt. I watched him carefully, playing the role of the doting wife to perfection. I asked him specific questions about the weather in Silicon Valley and how the tech summit handled the new software rollout. I watched his confidence grow as he piled one fabrication on top of another, emboldened by my seeming naivety. Then came the token of guilt. He reached into his bag and pulled out a gold box of chocolates, the kind you buy at the airport duty-free shop 5 minutes before boarding when you realize you have been a terrible husband. He held it out with a charming grin, expecting the usual reward of a hug and a kiss. I did not move. I did not smile. I let his hand hang in the air until the silence stretched thin and tight, like a rubber band about to snap. My voice dropped an octave, shifting from the warmth of a wife to the sterile coldness of an interrogator. I asked him, quite casually, about a peculiar notification I had received on our joint credit card statement earlier that afternoon. I asked him why there was a refund processed from a 5-star resort in Lake Tahoe for a spa service that was never used. Julian froze. His hands were midway through loosening his silk tie, and they simply stopped moving. His eyes darted to the left and then to the right, searching the room for an exit or an excuse. He laughed nervously, a hollow sound that bounced off the high ceilings. He started to stammer something about identity theft, claiming that the bank systems were always glitching or that perhaps his card had been skimmed at a gas station in San Francisco. I did not let him finish his clumsy explanation. I cut through his noise with a single, sharp sentence. I told him that I did not care about system errors. I looked him dead in the eye and asked who exactly he had booked the presidential suite for, specifically the package that included the couple's massage. The sound of his leather briefcase hitting the hardwood floor was like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like the blood had simply evaporated. He stood there, mouth slightly open, staring at me with the terrified realization that he was standing on a trap door that had already opened. I smiled then, but it was a smile devoid of any warmth. I told him that I had known the answer for days and that his performance had been a waste of breath. The curtain had fallen the moment he walked through the door. Looking at the man trembling before me, it was agonizing to remember the boy I met 10 years ago. We collided in the humid silence of a public library in Chicago. It was finals week, and we were both desperate, broke students reaching for the last available copy of a critical reference book. He had won the tug of war, but seeing the panic in my eyes, he handed it over with a shy smile. That simple act of kindness sparked a love story that I thought would last until my dying breath. Our romance was not built on diamond rings or trips to Paris. It was constructed from the humblest materials imaginable. We survived on dinners of instant noodles boiled in a shared pot and long walks in the park because we could not afford movie tickets. We spent nights dreaming about our careers, making pacts that we would climb out of our mountain of student debt together. I fell in love with his integrity. I remember clearly the day he walked all the way back to a grocery store in a snowstorm just to return $5 because the cashier had given him the wrong change. He told me he could not sleep knowing he had taken something that did not belong to him. That was the Julian I married. That was the man whose moral compass pointed true north. Our wedding was a testament to that simplicity. We went to City Hall on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I wore a white dress I bought on sale, and he wore a suit that was slightly too large for his frame. We had no guests, no reception, and no photographer, but the room was filled with our laughter. We toasted with cheap champagne in plastic cups, fueled by an absolute faith that we were invincible as long as we stood side by side. We moved to Seattle with nothing but 2 suitcases and a beat-up sedan. I started my career as a book editor, fixing the broken sentences of others, while Julian joined a rising tech giant called Next Gen Dynamics. We were a team. During those early, grinding years, he would come home exhausted, take my hands in his, and tell me that I was his anchor. He swore that he did not need fancy cars or corner offices, only me. We created a joint savings account we affectionately named The Dream. We scrutinized every receipt and saved every penny, planning for a house by the lake and debating names for the children we would raise there. I recall the sensation of falling asleep on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. It was a sanctuary. In the manuscripts I edited, adultery was a common plot twist, a cheap device used to create drama in paperback novels. I viewed it with the detachment of a professional, never once suspecting that the genre of my life was shifting from a romance to a tragedy. The transformation began 2 years ago, coinciding with his promotion to regional sales director. It was not an overnight change, but a slow erosion. The money started coming in waves rather than trickles. The relief of financial security was intoxicating, but it brought a poison with it. Julian began to crave the validation of strangers. He started to value the appearance of success over the substance of our life. I was so happy for him, so proud of how far we had come from that library in Chicago, that I did not notice the man I loved was slowly dying, replaced by a stranger who valued status over his soul. I did not see that I was losing him to the bright lights and the new temptations that success provided. The name Sienna first slipped into our conversations about 1 year ago. At first, she was merely the bright intern who knew how to operate the complicated espresso machine in the break room. Over time, she evolved into the indispensable assistant who organized his chaotic schedule better than he ever could. I never thought much of it until the man who used to wear button-down shirts until the collars frayed started buying Italian suits that cost more than our first car. He began wearing a heavy cologne that smelled of sandalwood, a scent I found cloying and overpowering, simply because Sienna had mentioned at a company holiday party that it was distinguished. The physical distance between us was mirrored by the digital fortress he built around himself. His phone, which was once tossed carelessly on the sofa or left on the kitchen counter, now lived permanently in his pocket or face down on the table. When I playfully tried to check the weather on his device one morning, I found the passcode had been changed. He snapped at me with sudden aggression, claiming it was a new mandatory security protocol from headquarters, but his eyes never met mine. He made me feel like a spy for simply touching an object that used to be communal property. I started to feel like a nuisance in my own marriage. A simple question about his return time was met with a heavy sigh or a roll of the eyes if I asked who was texting him at 11 at night. I was accused of being paranoid. He became a master of turning the tables, telling me that my insecurities were suffocating him and that he could not breathe under the weight of my suspicion. I began to apologize for asking questions that any normal wife would ask. I walked on eggshells in my own home, terrified of triggering his annoyance, convinced that I was the toxic one. The climax of this tension arrived 3 weeks ago. Julian announced that he had to attend the most critical tech summit of the year in San Francisco. He told me he would be gone for 10 days. When I suggested tagging along, thinking we could turn the evenings into a mini vacation or at least have dinner together, he shut me down with a speed that stung. He insisted his schedule would be packed from dawn until dusk and that I would only be miserable sitting alone in a hotel room. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor by leaving me behind. painting a picture of a grueling work trip that no one would enjoy. In the days leading up to his departure, he was physically present but emotionally absent. He avoided my touch, flinching away from my hand on his shoulder as if I were burning him. He claimed he was consumed by stress over his keynote presentation, but the coldness radiating from him felt personal. It was during this freezing silence that I discovered a small, hard lump in my breast. The doctor ordered an immediate biopsy. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry into my husband's chest and have him tell me everything would be fine. But when I looked at his distant profile across the dinner table, the words died in my throat. I could not bear the thought of him dismissing my terror as another attempt to grab his attention or guilt-trip him before his big trip. So, I swallowed my fear. I told myself that my suspicion of him was just a side effect of my health anxiety. I convinced myself that I was projecting my internal chaos onto our marriage. I decided to be the understanding, supportive wife one last time so I would not distract him from his career. On the morning he left, the sun had not yet risen. He stood by the door, checked his watch, and gave me a quick, dry peck on the forehead. He did not look back as he walked to the taxi. He had no idea that it was the last kiss he would ever give me as his wife. On the third day after Julian left, my phone rang with the number I had been dreading. It was my doctor. When she told me the tumor was benign, the relief was so physical that my knees buckled. I sat on the kitchen floor, weeping with gratitude, and my first instinct was to call my husband. I needed to hear his voice. I needed him to know that we were safe. I dialed his number, desperate for connection. The line connected for a brief second before he manually declined the call. In that fleeting moment before the silence took over, I did not hear the hushed tones of a conference room. I heard the distinct clinking of silverware against china and the raucous laughter of a woman. Almost immediately, a pre-written text message popped up on my screen, claiming he was in a closed meeting with partners and could not talk, followed by the words, "Love you." The lie sat on my screen, glowing and toxic. The disconnect between the sounds of a party and the text about a meeting triggered a primal alarm in my brain. The naive wife who trusted blindly died in that moment. I remembered his old tablet tucked away in the bottom drawer of the desk, the one with the cracked screen that was still logged into his account. I powered it on and opened the location tracking application. The blue dot representing my husband was nowhere near San Francisco. It was hovering over a mountain range hundreds of miles away. He was at a luxury ski resort in Lake Tahoe. My hands did not shake. I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. I looked up the number for the Ritz-Carlton in Tahoe and dialed the front desk. I deepened my voice, adopting the clipped, professional tone of an executive assistant. I told the receptionist that I needed to forward some urgent documents to Mr. Julian and needed to confirm his room number to ensure they arrived at the correct suite. The receptionist was helpful and completely unsuspecting. She confirmed that he was staying in the presidential suite. I paused for a beat, letting the extravagance of that room sink in, and then I asked the question that would seal his fate. I asked if his wife was available to receive a complimentary gift basket I wanted to arrange. The receptionist replied cheerfully that Mrs. Sienna was currently with him at the spa, so they could receive it together later. Hearing her name spoken aloud was like taking a physical blow to the chest. Sienna, the intern, the assistant, the woman who had smiled at me at the Christmas party. It was no longer a paranoia. It was a confirmed fact. But instead of collapsing into a puddle of tears, the pain crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. I was done being the victim. I walked into our home office and booted up the desktop computer. I knew Julian was lazy with his digital hygiene at home. I spent the next hour digging. It did not take long to find the hidden folders he thought were clever. They were filled with hundreds of photos taken over the last year. Julian and Sienna at dinners, at concerts, and in bed. They looked happy. They looked like a couple. But the photos were nothing compared to the chat logs. I read through their messages and felt my stomach turn. They were not just having an affair. They were actively mocking me. They called me a boring old woman who held him back. I read their detailed plans to file for divorce the moment he returned from this trip, plotting to kick me out of the house I had helped build. They were laughing at my ignorance while I was at home worrying about cancer. I sat before the glowing monitor, the blue light reflecting in my eyes, staring at a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet titled The Next Chapter. It was not a draft of a novel or a business proposal. It was a budget, a meticulous, detailed financial plan for a life that did not include me, Julian, the man who claimed he could never balance our checkbook without my help, had constructed a complex roadmap for his future with Sienna. I scrolled through the rows and columns, and with every click, a piece of my history was erased. The account we called The Dream, the one we had contributed to for 8 years to buy our house by the lake and to pay for the children we planned to have, was being systematically drained. He was not just stealing money, he was stealing our memories. He had been siphoning off funds to pay for diamond earrings, designer handbags, and weekend getaways, labeling them in the spreadsheet as investments. Then I saw the date that made my blood run cold. I cross-referenced the spreadsheet with my own calendar. 3 weeks ago, on the Tuesday morning I went in for my biopsy. I had texted him from the waiting room, terrified and alone. I remembered staring at the fluorescent lights, praying that the lump in my breast was not cancer. At that exact hour, the spreadsheet recorded a wire transfer of $15,000. The description read, "Deposit for S's convertible." Shh! While I was lying on a cold medical table with a needle in my chest, wondering if I would live to see another birthday, my husband was at a dealership buying a sports car for his mistress. The cruelty did not stop at the money. I opened his archived messages and found the narrative he had spun for Sienna. In his version of reality, I was not the loving wife who had supported him while he earned his master's degree. I was a monster. He told her that I was a bitter, frigid woman who refused to sign divorce papers. He claimed I was emotionally abusive and that I was the one draining his bank account. He had painted himself as the victim of a loveless marriage, trapped by a vindictive harpy, to justify his infidelity. I printed every single document. The printer rhythmic humming was the only sound in the apartment for over an hour. I took a thick red marker and went through the bank statements I had downloaded. I circled the $300 dinners on Tuesday nights when he claimed to be working late. I circled the business class plane tickets booked for Sienna under a guest name, while his company only reimbursed for economy. I circled the 5-star hotel suites in cities where he had no clients. Then I found the email confirmation for the trip he was currently on. It was for the Ritz-Carlton in Lake Tahoe. The special request section at the bottom of the booking read, "First anniversary celebration. Please arrange for 24 red roses and a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir." They were celebrating 1 year of lying to my face. But the final blow, the one that truly solidified my hatred, was the password. I tried to access a hidden savings account he had set up for their emergency fund. I guessed the password on the very first try. It was the date of our wedding. He was using the day we vowed to be faithful to one another as the key to the vault that funded his betrayal. I did not cry. The tears simply evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. I had 3 days left before Julian returned, and I did not waste a single minute. I contacted a ruthless divorce attorney, and we drafted a petition that was lethal. We used the evidence of his financial fraud to claim the apartment, the car, and the majority of our remaining assets. Then, I began to pack. I took his clothes, his shoes, his expensive watches, and the awards he was so proud of, and I sealed them into brown cardboard boxes. But I did not stack them by the door. That would be too obvious. I hid everything in the back of the storage room. I wanted the apartment to look perfectly normal when he walked in. I wanted him to feel safe. I wanted him to think he had gotten away with it, just so I could watch the hope die in his eyes when I sprung the trap. Julian recovered from his shock quickly, his survival instinct kicking in with a desperate, frantic energy. He took a step toward me, hands raised in a placating gesture, and started babbling the predictable defense. He swore that I was misunderstanding everything, that Sienna was merely a colleague who happened to be at the same resort for a team-building exercise, and that my imagination was running wild. He looked me in the eye and told me I was crazy. I did not scream. I did not throw a vase. I simply reached under the coffee table and pulled out the heavy manila folder I had prepared. I dropped it onto the glass surface with a dull thud. It slid across the table and stopped right in front of his knees. He looked down, and his denial died in his throat. The folder was open, revealing high-resolution photographs taken by a private investigator I had hired online 3 days ago. They were crystal clear. There was Julian, not in a conference room, but in a hot tub, holding a glass of champagne. There was Julian kissing Sienna by the ski lift. There was Julian carrying her laughing form over the threshold of their suite. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a single, crumpled piece of paper. I placed it gently on top of the photos of his illicit vacation. It was my medical report. I spoke softly, my voice devoid of the tremor he probably expected. I told him that while he was skiing and drinking vintage Pinot Noir with his mistress, I was lying on a cold operating table waiting to find out if the lump in my breast was going to kill me. I told him that while he was celebrating his fake anniversary, I was sitting in a waiting room alone, watching the clock and terrified of my own body. The color that had drained from his face earlier did not return. He looked at the medical report, then at me, and his legs gave out. He sank to the floor, kneeling on the hardwood, and buried his face in his hands. He began to sob, a jagged, ugly sound. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, and begged for forgiveness. He swore on his life that he did not know about the biopsy. He claimed that if he had known I was sick, he never would have gone. I looked down at him with the detachment of a surgeon cutting out necrotic tissue. I told him that he did not know because he was too busy declining my calls to entertain his girlfriend. I reminded him that ignorance was not an excuse when it was a deliberate choice. He chose to silence me so he could hear her laugh. Then came the final strike. I informed him that earlier that morning. I had visited the bank. Since our names were both on the joint checking account and the savings fund we called the Dream, I had every legal right to access them. I told him that I had transferred every single cent into a new, private account solely in my name to protect our assets from what I categorized as financial fraud and reckless spending. Julian scrambled for his phone, his fingers fumbling as he opened his banking app. I watched the realization dawn on him as he saw the balance reading 0. He tried to switch to his credit card app, only to find that his cards had been reported lost and were currently frozen. He was standing in his own home, but he was destitute. I pulled my diamond wedding band off my finger. It felt heavy, burdened with 8 years of lies. I dropped it directly into the open box of chocolates he had bought at the airport. It landed with a soft thud on top of a caramel square. I told him that the chocolate was likely bitter, so it would suit him much better than it would ever suit me. I pointed to the door and told him to leave. I told him he could not stay here, and since his cards were declined, he had better find a cheap motel that accepted cash, provided he had any in his wallet. The look of absolute devastation on his face as he picked up his suitcase was the first honest thing I had seen from him in years. Watching the elevator doors close on Julian and his pathetic suitcase felt like a victory, but I knew the war was only half won. He was just one head of the snake, and leaving the other one intact would be a mistake I was not willing to make. During my sleepless nights of investigation, I had not just focused on my husband, I had turned my attention to Sienna as well. It was terrifyingly easy to find her life mapped out on social media. I discovered she was engaged to a man named Ethan, a 28-year-old architect with kind eyes and a feed full of sketches. They were scheduled to get married in exactly 1 month. I tracked Ethan down and sent him a message claiming I had information about a potential venue issue for his upcoming wedding to ensure he would meet me. We met at a quiet coffee shop on 3rd Avenue the next morning at 9 o'clock. He looked exhausted, likely from the stress of wedding planning, and he checked his watch twice before he even sat down. When I introduced myself not as a wedding planner but as the wife of the man his fiancée was currently sleeping with, his reaction was immediate and defensive. He stood up, scraping his chair against the floor, and looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. He told me I was delusional. He explained with absolute certainty that Sienna was currently on a business trip with her female supervisor, a woman named Linda, and that I was clearly a jealous woman trying to wreck a happy home. He started to walk away, convinced I was unhinged. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed my tablet on the small round table and pressed play. I had access to the cloud account linked to Julian's car, which automatically uploaded dashcam footage. I had found a video from 2 days ago. It showed the interior of the car as Julian drove them toward the ski slopes. The audio was crystal clear. Ethan stopped. He looked down at the screen, and I watched the blood drain from his face. On the video, Julian and Sienna were holding hands over the center console. But it was not the intimacy that broke him. It was the cruelty. Sienna was laughing, telling Julian that she was relieved to be away from Ethan. She called him boring and predictable. Then, she brought up the wedding dress Ethan had helped her pick out. She called it a cheap rag that looked like a curtain and said she could not believe she had to wear it just to shut him up. Ethan sat back down slowly, his legs no longer able to support him. He watched the woman he loved mock his taste, his personality, and his love. The silence that fell between us was heavy with shared grief. We were two strangers connected by the sharpest kind of pain, sitting amidst the bustle of the morning coffee rush. I watched the denial leave his eyes, replaced by a hollow, haunting devastation. I let him sit with the pain for 10 minutes before I spoke again. I told him that he could go home and scream at her, or he could help me finish this properly. I knew their engagement party was scheduled for this coming Saturday, a large gathering with her entire family. I suggested he wait until then to reveal the truth. When he seemed hesitant, I played my final card. I slid a second document across the table. It was a transfer record. I explained that Sienna had not just been investing her time with Julian, she had been investing his money. Ethan had mentioned a down payment for a house on his social media. I showed him proof that Sienna had withdrawn $40,000 from their joint savings account, claiming she was moving it to a high-yield bond. In reality, she had transferred it to Julian to cover a massive loss he had incurred trading tech stocks, a loss he was too afraid to tell me about. Ethan stared at the paper. The betrayal was now total. She had stolen his heart and his future home. He looked up at me, and the kindness in his eyes had hardened into something steel gray. He nodded once. We did not need to shake hands. We had formed a silent pact, a coalition of the heartbroken, and we were going to burn their lies to the ground. On Sunday night, the apartment was quiet, but the internet connection was blazing fast. I sat at the kitchen island with a glass of water and the digital evidence I had curated with the precision of a museum archivist. I attached a comprehensive file to an email addressed to the ethics board and the chief financial officer of NextGen Dynamics. The subject line was simple misappropriation of corporate funds and code of conduct violations. It was not just about the affair. Adultery might get a slap on the wrist in the corporate world, but theft was a capital offense. I had highlighted the receipts where Julian had charged the couple's massage and the champagne at the ski resort to his corporate expense account, labeling them as client entertainment with a non-existent potential investor. He had stolen over $3,000 from the company to pamper his mistress. I hit send at exactly 11 o'clock at night. Monday morning arrived with a gray, drizzling sky. I knew Julian would show up at the office desperate to save his career, thinking that if he could just keep his job, he might be able to claw his way back to financial stability. He walked into the glass lobby of the NextGen Tower at 8:45 in the morning, wearing one of the few suits I had not packed into a box. From my vantage point in the coffee shop directly across the street, I watched through the rain-streaked window. He approached the security turnstiles and tapped his badge. Nothing happened. He tapped it again, harder this time, a look of confusion crossing his face. A small red light flashed on the console. 2 security guards, men he likely walked past every day without a second glance, stepped forward. They did not smile. They flanked him and escorted him not to the elevators, but to the reception desk where a temporary visitor pass was issued, and then they accompanied him up to the 25th floor. I knew exactly what was waiting for him there. The human resources director would be sitting behind a mahogany desk with the dossier I had sent. Sienna would be summoned shortly after. I sipped my cappuccino, waiting for the finale. It took nearly 2 hours. At 10:30, the revolving doors of the building spun slowly. Julian emerged first, holding a white cardboard box that contained the remnants of his professional identity, a stapler, a few framed photos, and a coffee mug. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. His shoulders slumped under the weight of public humiliation. A moment later, Sienna followed. She was crying, clutching her purse and a similar box, trying to shield her face from the curious glances of the smokers huddled under the awning. They had been terminated for cause. There would be no severance package, no glowing references, and no unemployment benefits. They were walking out into a recession with a black mark on their records that screamed fraud. My phone buzzed on the table. It was Julian. I picked it up, not because I cared, but because I wanted him to know that I was the architect of his downfall. He was screaming before I even put the phone to my ear. He sounded unhinged, accusing me of being a vindictive monster, asking how I could destroy his livelihood and leave him with absolutely nothing. He yelled that I had gone too far and that this was cruel beyond measure. I waited for him to run out of breath. When silence finally fell on the line, I spoke with a calm that frightened even me. I told him that I had done nothing but forward the truth to the people who deserved to know it. I explained that he was the one who swiped the corporate card. He was the one who broke the code of conduct. I told him that the consequences he was facing were the direct result of the actions he took. I did not ruin his life. I just stopped cleaning up his messes. I did not wait for a rebuttal. I hung up the phone and immediately blocked his number. It was the final severing of the tie. He was now a ghost, a bad memory that could no longer reach me. I left the coffee shop and walked to a hardware store 3 blocks away. I bought 5 gallons of paint. For 8 years, our apartment had been painted a cool, detached slate gray because Julian insisted it was modern and masculine. I hated it. I bought the brightest shade of cerulean blue I could find, the color of a summer sky at noon. I spent the rest of the afternoon covering up the gray walls, and with every stroke of the roller, I felt the heavy atmosphere of the apartment lift, replaced by something fresh, vibrant, and entirely mine. The engagement party took place on a crisp Saturday evening at Sienna's parents' house, a sprawling estate that screamed old money. I was not there, but I knew every detail as if I had been sitting in the front row. Ethan waited for the perfect moment, right after the first course was served and the champagne had been poured for the toasts. He tapped his glass for silence, standing up in his tuxedo, looking every bit the devoted fiancé. The guests leaned in, expecting a tearful declaration of love. Instead, Ethan pulled out his phone and began to read. He did not read poetry. He read the text messages Sienna had sent to Julian, the ones where she described Ethan as a boring placeholder and mocked his financial status compared to my husband's perceived wealth. He then gestured to the large projection screen set up in the garden. It was supposed to display a montage of their childhood photos and romantic moments. Ethan had swapped the file. Suddenly, the high-definition images of Julian and Sienna embracing in the hot tub at Lake Tahoe illuminated the night. The shock in the crowd was palpable. Sienna's mother actually fainted into her husband's arms, overcome by the sheer humiliation. Sienna stood frozen in the center of the chaos, her face pale, unable to utter a single word of defense because the proof was literally 10 feet tall behind her. Ethan did not yell. He simply announced into the microphone that the wedding was canceled. He turned to Sienna and demanded the immediate return of the diamond engagement ring and full repayment of every dollar he had spent on the deposits within 24 hours, or he would file a lawsuit for fraud. It was a masterclass in dignity, but the chaos was not over. Julian, drunk on cheap liquor and desperation, crashed the gates. Sienna had apparently called him in a panic when the slideshow started. He stumbled onto the lawn, disheveled and looking nothing like the executive he used to be. He tried to play the hero, shouting slurred insults at Ethan, but he only succeeded in starting a brawl with Ethan's older brother, a former linebacker. It did not end well for Julian. The police arrived within 10 minutes. I can only imagine the sight of my husband, face bruised and hands cuffed behind his back, being shoved into the back of a patrol car for disorderly conduct and criminal trespassing. Back in my apartment, the silence was peaceful. My phone buzzed on the coffee table with a single message from Ethan. It read simply, "It is done. Thank you." I put the phone down and picked up my glass of wine. I looked around at the walls, now a vibrant, fresh blue, and felt a profound sense of closure. The destruction of Julian and Sienna was absolute. In less than a week, they had lost their jobs, their reputations, their relationships, and now, their freedom. I realized then that I had not really had to lift a finger to destroy them. All I had done was shine a light on their actions. The most effective revenge was not screaming or fighting, it was simply handing them the shovel and watching them dig their own graves with their lies. 6 months had passed since the chaotic night of the engagement party. I sat in the plush leather chair of my attorney's office, the final decree of divorce resting on the mahogany desk between us. The black ink was still wet on my signature. It was finally over. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Julian walked in to sign his portion of the documents. I almost did not recognize the man who entered the room. He looked 10 years older than the last time I saw him. His hair was thinning and graying at the temples, and the arrogant, confident posture of a high-flying regional director was gone, replaced by the permanent stoop of a broken man. I heard through the grapevine that he was working as a delivery driver now, barely scraping by on minimum wage, and living in a damp basement apartment that smelled of mildew because no respectable landlord would rent to him with his credit score in ruins. He paused before picking up the pen, trying to catch my eye. He started to stammer a final apology, mumbling something about regret and how much he missed the life we had built. I looked at him, and I waited for the familiar burn of anger to flare up in my chest. I waited for the crushing weight of sadness. But there was absolutely nothing. He was just a stranger I used to know, a ghost of a memory that had lost its power to haunt me. I did not hate him anymore because hate requires energy, and he was no longer worth a single calorie of my energy. Thanks to the aggressive strategy my lawyer employed, citing his deliberate financial dissipation of our marital assets to fund his affair, the judge had ruled in my favor. I was awarded full ownership of the apartment and the majority of our remaining savings to recoup the funds he had stolen. He walked away with his debt and his regrets. I walked away with my dignity and my home. Stepping out of the courthouse, the crisp spring air hit my face. It tasted sweet, like rain and new beginnings. For the first time in 8 years, my chest did not feel tight. I saw Ethan waiting on a bench near the fountain. We had not become lovers, that would have been too messy and predictable. Instead, we had forged a deep, platonic friendship, bonded by the fires we had both walked through. He looked happy, lighter, and free from the dead weight of a woman who never valued him. We nodded at each other, a silent acknowledgement that we had survived the storm and come out stronger on the other side. My career had flourished in the wake of the chaos. I was promoted to senior editor at the publishing house just last week. I had channeled every ounce of my pain and experience into a new project, editing a raw, non-fiction book about recovering from emotional trauma and financial betrayal. It was already climbing the bestseller lists. I realized now that the benign tumor and the betrayal were not punishments. They were violent wake-up calls. They were the universe shaking me by the shoulders, demanding that I stop living for a man who did not see me and start loving the woman in the mirror. That evening, I sat on my balcony, wrapped in a warm blanket. The city lights of Seattle twinkled below me like a sea of diamonds. I was not alone. Curled up at my feet was a golden retriever puppy I had adopted 2 weeks ago. He let out a soft, happy sigh, and I reached down to scratch behind his ears. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from an unknown number. The preview showed a wall of frantic text, pleading for financial help, begging for a second chance. I knew it was Sienna. I did not feel a spike of adrenaline. I did not feel a need to gloat. I simply swiped left and pressed delete. I took a sip of my wine and looked out at the endless horizon. I was not lonely. I was free. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country and share your thoughts on Alara's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, hit the like button, and press the hype button to help this video reach more people.